In a bid to protect endangered wildlife and combat wildlife trafficking, Nigeria is working on a new law known as the Endangered Species Conservation and Protection Bill, initially sponsored by former members of the House of Representatives, Honourable Johnson Oguma and Honourable Sam Onuigbo. Drawing from international best practices, this bill aims to bring Nigeria in compliance with key international conventions.
The bill is very important to all humans because even animals, they have right to life, but the endangered species, they are not easy to come by, and we need to preserve them for future generations. And that the bill is not just needed now, it's a necessity, something that we ought to have had before now. But just that now that there is an international law convention which Nigeria subscribed to, we need to try and do everything possible to domesticate it so that we will not be left behind.
The Endangered Species Conservation and Protection Bill passed its first reading in the House of Representatives in January 2023. NGOs including Africa Nature Investors Foundation and the Environmental Investigation Agency have helped to draft this legislation. However, the bill didn't scale through before Nigeria's 2023 elections, and the previous sponsors are no longer a part of the 10th National Assembly, which was inaugurated in June 2023. Therefore, a new sponsor will be necessary to move this forward.
The discussions have gone far. However, I wouldn't want to say much so as not to preempt the sponsor of the bill. The National Assembly has the mandate to make laws, and I think it should be best for them to take the lead. However, I am aware that the National Assembly is quite interested in this, and a new sponsor is going to emerge very soon.
This bill seeks to address organized wildlife crime, corruption, and protect Nigeria's unique biodiversity. The proposed legislation will empower law enforcement agencies with increased investigative powers, allowing them to conduct financial inquiries and intelligence-led operations. This is crucial in tracking down those responsible for wildlife crimes.
A legislative analysis of the legal framework underpinning Nigeria's effort to address wildlife trafficking, undertaken by the Environmental Investigation Agency UK and its partner, African Nature Investors Foundation, that is ANI Foundation, found that the current suite of laws, for addressing wildlife trafficking in Nigeria is really riddled with a lot of loopholes, a lot of weaknesses, and a lot of inconsistencies, which make it really difficult for Nigeria to meet its obligations under the convention. For example, our wildlife-specific law, that is the Endangered Species Act, by which Nigeria actually tries to domesticate CITES, really falls short of what is expected. For instance, under the convention, the CITES Convention, Nigeria is supposed to criminalize all trades, all import-export of cited listed species in violation of the convention. Unfortunately, when you look at that act, you find that there is no express criminalization of import-export of CITES listed species.
According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Nigeria has been implicated in the trafficking of around 30 metric tons of seized ivory between 2009 and 2017. Additionally, in 2019, it is reported that approximately 51 metric tons of seized pangolin scales were traced back to the country. Furthermore, the 2020 World Wildlife Crime Report indicates that from around 2011 onwards, growing volumes of rosewood were exported from West Africa, with a steep rise in 2017 when 825,000 cubic meters of rosewood logs, which is equivalent to about 4 million trees, were exported from the region and predominantly Nigeria. The new bill proposes stronger penalties to combat these crimes and serve as a deterrent. Currently, the Endangered Species Act, amended in 2016, imposes fines of 5 million naira and imprisonment for a year for a repeat offender. Former Minister of Environment, Honorable Mohammed Hassan Abdullahi, says the increase in penalties is seriously needed.
Now, we realize that when you take people to prison, for instance, for offences against our forest resources, they are not too, they don't seem to feel that impact. But when you find them, when you provide such kind of penalties in terms of monetary penalties, they feel the pinch. So this emphasizes more on penalties that are monetary in nature, that will first be used, for forest conservation, and then used for enforcement, and also used to support afforestation projects. So I think that one of the best approach is the penalties that this new act seems to provide.
Moreover, the legislation seeks to expedite wildlife cases, enabling courts to efficiently handle these matters, recover assets, establish corporate liability, and foster international cooperation and extradition to ensure that criminals cannot escape justice.
They are very often accompanied also by organized crimes and other forms of illegal activities, such as human trafficking and other things, drug trafficking. This bill should bring about a clearer definition of those wildlife crimes, should bring about sentences that are sufficiently deterring such forms of crime.
To avoid any ambiguity, definitions are clarified and clear roles for key agencies that were previously unclear are established, ensuring a streamlined and effective approach towards conservation and wildlife protection. The proposed legislation also creates new offences, such as damaging critical habitats, violating permits, introducing invasive species, obstruction, and preparing to commit illegal acts. By doing so, it covers various aspects to safeguard the environment.
So this law seeks to bring, regulatory agencies and policymakers in one basket to be able to harmonize their approach towards crime prevention in our forest and ensure that there is sustainable use, of the forest.
The NGOs spearheading this bill have already started fresh discussions with the Environment Committee chairs in both chambers of the National Assembly. Their primary goal is to ensure the bill's expeditious passage, and its success hinges on garnering widespread support from the public and the government. Layla Johnson Salami, Arise News.
What an eye-opening report there by Layla Johnson Salami. But for a bit more on that crucial subject, we're now being joined by Wilson Ogoke, who is the Wildlife Policy Coordinator at Africa Nature Investors Foundation. Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here on The Morning Show.
Good morning.
All right, then. So let's get straight into it. Can you elaborate on the gravity and the complexities of the current wildlife situation in Nigeria and how the proposed legislation aims to address these challenges? And how can this proposed wildlife law empower law enforcement agencies to act more decisively in combating wildlife crimes?
Yes, thank you very much. Now, a study conducted by the Environmental Investigation Agency and Annie Foundation found that the current suite of laws, that is the legislative framework which underpins the current efforts to address this crime, it's really, it has a lot of problems. So Nigeria is a party to CITES, that is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. But it's not only CITES, we are also party to Convention on Migratory Species, that is a CMS, Convention on Biological Diversity, and other environmental treaties and agreements, which are really aimed to help us to address the serious threats to biodiversity, not only in Nigeria, but across Africa and the rest of the world. Unfortunately, our efforts to domesticate these treaties and even implementation has been very problematic. I've already mentioned that import-export, of CITES listed species in violation of the convention is not expressly criminalized. And that is not the only problem. A further problem is if you look at the act and you accept that or otherwise dealing with, which is the expression that the act uses. If you agree that that includes import-export, the next hurdle you meet immediately is the penalty. The penalty is 5 million naira. For first offender, you don't go to prison. For a recidivist offender, that is a repeat offender, then you have 12 months imprisonment. Now, the first challenge you have with that is that, remember, these are cross-border offenses. And you really the laws really need to be in such a way that you should be able to take advantage of any assistance, any resources that are available, both locally and internationally, to address the crime. Now, the problem with having such sentence for this crime is that extraditable offenses, for instance, under the Extradition Act in Nigeria, starts from offenses with minimum of 2 years imprisonment. So that means that import-export, offenses related to endangered species, if we agree that the Endangered Species Act criminalizes that offense, which it doesn't expressly, then that means that offenses under that particular act are not extraditable. That's a problem. Now, when you go to the endangered species, that is a National Environmental Protection of Endangered Species in International Trade Regulations 2011. An effort was made there to introduce stricter penalties for import-export offenses. Now, the challenge, of course, is that this is a ministerial regulation, which now is imposing 3 years imprisonment with option of fine. And that also is problematic because you would expect that in a modern democracy, right? If you're going to send someone to prison for 3 years, the legislation by which you're doing that should at least have passed through the legislative process and, been approved by the legislature. And so the question then is, for purposes of extradition, would it qualify as an extraditable offense? Would an offense under a ministerial regulation qualify? No, in my opinion, it doesn't. So that's another challenge there. Now, we have a situation now where the best legislation for sort of prosecuting these import-export offenses is now the Customs and Excise Management Act, which provides for 5 years imprisonment without option of fine. So that's a good legislation. The Nigeria Customs has been, prosecuting some of these cases in courts. But the challenge is that, remember, the big picture is that we are trying to conserve biodiversity, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa. Now, the threats, when you look at biodiversity, the threats they face go beyond import-export offenses. There is also the domestic bushmeat trade. There are the habitat offenses, the degradation and the fragmentation of habitats. And so you really you have a situation where the wildlife-specific laws that we have are not sufficient to address the cross-border elements of this crime. Now, if we bring it locally and say, look at hunting, which is another, issue that threatens biodiversity in Nigeria, or even rampant logging. If we take the last incident in Nigeria where an elephant was shot, as an example. Now, if a law enforcement agency said they want to take up that offense, for instance, to prosecute it. Now, the first obstacle in their path will be, are elephants protected under the Endangered Species Act? Now, if you look at Schedule 1 of the Endangered Species Act, what it protects is immature elephants. Now, immature elephants is not defined in that act. But let's say the offense happened in Taraba State or Adamawa State and you wanted to use the wildlife-specific law in those two states. Again, you have the same obstacle. What is protected is immature elephants. In the law of Taraba State, for instance, that is now defined, and it's limited to elephants whose tusks have a combined weight of 22 pounds. That's about 9 kilograms. In contrast, the average adult female elephant, the tusk of the average female elephant weighs maybe between 18 and 20 kilograms. So you have a lot of, the protection is not complete, right? So you would struggle to find a wildlife-specific law within the country to prosecute that offense. If you look at the endangered species regulation and say, okay, let us fall back to that, ignoring all the issues about whether it's a regulatory offense, a regulatory ministerial regulation or not, the challenge you have there is that it says nothing about hunting. It says nothing about prohibited means of hunting. So you see that you have gaps. You don't have we don't have a sufficient range of offenses to address wildlife crime in the current suite of laws that we have. So the Endangered Species Bill addresses that. It addresses the threats, to biodiversity from international trade. So you have robust provisions which regulates international trade, and also remember, not only international trade, but taking of CMS, Convention on Migratory Species, Appendix 1 listed species, is something that if you do it in violation of that convention, we have an obligation to criminalize it. And so the bill, of course, introduces that crime, which is something that ought to have been done. And assuming we had that in place now, someone who goes ahead and shoots an elephant will immediately go in for it, because the challenge in the example, in the case study we are using, which is the elephant that was shot, remember, that's not international trade, so it doesn't really come under CITES. However, elephants are listed in Appendix 1 of the Convention on Migratory Species. They are, a transboundary species. They move across countries, so they are protected. If we had that in place, if we had that criminalization of taking of Appendix 1 CMS species in place today, then it will be very simple to point to a law that takes the person who did that shooting and convicts the person. So that is some of the challenges that the bill will address. In addition to that, it also includes, as Leila has mentioned, a very detailed definition section. Why is that important? Well, the current law that we have, for instance, I already mentioned, it uses the expression or otherwise deals in. That is not, defined in the current act that we have, and so you have a situation where ideally we should fall back on judicial interpretation of what that means. But wildlife cases have not gone to the courts so much. They are not cases that our courts have seen. So there is very little or no judicial interpretation you can turn to. So it's important for a bill of this nature to have very clear statutory definitions, so that it's very clear what offenses are created and what is permissible under the Act. I also mentioned habitats, stress to habitats, fragmentation of habitats. So you have robust provisions in that bill which aim to entrench the precautionary principle, which is something that we are supposed to do under the Convention on Biological Diversity. We also have provisions which try to protect our Ramsar-listed wetlands. That is the Convention on Wetlands. We do have a regulation on wetlands in this country. However, remember, Nigeria is a dualist country, and that means international treaties that Nigeria goes into, no matter how well drafted, if we don't come back and then the National Assembly replicates them in a national legislation, then of course we'll struggle with implication. And in appropriate cases, you might have a due process challenge raised in court to say, well, you're prosecuting me under a ministerial regulation, but I need to see the legislation that has domesticated this in Nigeria. So the bill goes far and protects for all of these things. And then for for sentences, remember, it's not just about arresting people. The real aim of this law is to ensure at the end that there is very strong prosecution, that there is very swift, trial without delays, and that the sentences are, proportionate, and that they are consistent. So the bill has provisions that will ensure that sentences are commensurate to the harm caused to biodiversity and the environment, and that the sentences, of course, reflect the extent of culpability, that is the extent of guilt. So they are graded accordingly in a way that if they are implemented and utilized in that way, you can begin to have deterrence. So that's some of the challenges with the current laws that we have, and the bill has introduced some of these measures I mentioned. Now, I would also hasten to add that one of the challenges we've had in Nigeria is the way our wildlife governance has happened over time. So we have this division between the federal level and the state level, and there is no communication between them. Of course, most of the state level wildlife laws, I should add, are very, very, very outdated. Most of them predate CITES and the other key environmental conventions that we have, and so don't even recognize the measures that have been taken under those conventions. So the bill has provisions that will ensure, for instance, that some offenses created by the states, when they are violated, violation of state-level laws can become federal offenses. So it makes provision for all of that. It also tries to introduce measures to boost interagency cooperation and coordination, because remember, this is a very complex and dynamic crime. To address it properly, you need to be able to gather all the resources you have. But the current suite of laws we have, leads to fragmentation of approach. So you have a situation where agencies are now working in silos. And so measures are introduced in the bill to try and make sure that there is coordination and that everybody is singing from the same page. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for going into the importance of detailed legislation and the importance of updating our laws. I would like for you to speak more to the importance of biodiversity, because you've spoken a lot about biodiversity and the importance of having a healthy habitat and a healthy ecosystem. So if you can explain more to us, why is biodiversity important to us as Nigerians?
Well, that's a good one. Well, biodiversity is very important. I think the starting point really should be Section 20 of the Nigerian Constitution. And that provision is really important because that is where the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria makes an important promise to every Nigerian. And that promise is that Nigeria will look after, will safeguard our environment, will safeguard our water, our wildlife, our forests. Now, why does the Constitution make that promise? It makes that promise because the enjoyment of a clean and stable, healthy environment is very closely linked to having biodiversity and having your wildlife resources thriving, having your nature thriving the way it should. And that's because wildlife, trees and animals, provide important ecosystem services, from where we get the clean air we breathe, the oxygen we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink. They play important water catchment functions. Wildlife species like elephants, for instance, in the wild play an important role in dispersing seeds. You have wildlife species like vulture who have, who play a public sanitation role, if you like. So it's really important that these wildlife resources are conserved and protected. For instance, if you look down in the Delta, the destruction of the mangroves, there are studies that have shown that the destruction of the mangrove that you have in the Delta from oil pollution and all of that is one of the reasons why we are now having flooding across the country. So it's really important that we safeguard them, that we protect them. Of course, I will hasten to add that wildlife too, they have economic value. If you look at the countries in southern part of Africa, the eastern part of Africa, many of them are not oil producing countries, but they have a very viable forex earner by way of tourism. And so this is something that we can develop. Nigeria used to have elephant populations, scattered across the country, but unsustainable use and exploitation has, destroyed them to the point where we now have very few populations, under 1,000. And this problem is not limited to Nigeria. Also across Africa. I mean, in the 1970s, we used to have maybe 4.1 million elephants, roaming across the continent. But because of the way they've been used, they've been hunted, and killed unsustainably, I should add, that has led to their numbers dropping to as low as 400,000. So there is really a very important need for us to protect these wildlife resources, because if we lose them, we lose the ecosystem services they provide. Species like pangolins, for instance, provide a very important pest control function. So one pangolin eats, thousands of insects a year. Now, if we had to invest in pesticides to, control insects without relying on pangolins and frogs and other, insectivores, we would have to spend a lot of foreign currency to do that. But here we have, by nature given to us a system that ensures that there is that balance and that it is maintained in nature. So it's really tied to the well-being of our environment and to our well-being, and we should do everything we can to protect them.
Well, all right. I wish we had more time on this segment. Thank you so much for enlightening us, and well done. Kudos with everything you're doing so far.